This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News. This week's featured stories, like all that we publish at the Heartland Daily News, are designed to bring you public policy events and news that affects your life, your health, your freedoms, and things that affect the nation's economy. We're covering 3 stories today. One's an election update, one's some tax news out of the state of Georgia, and an article entitled, "Who Really Imperils the Republic?" All of these sound intriguing, don't they? So we're going to just jump right in. The Supreme Court's going to hear the first of many election lawsuits. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, numerous bills introduced in state legislatures across the country are most likely headed to the same place, the Supreme Court, where they're going to be scrutinized under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first of many such cases will begin on Tuesday. After widespread voter fraud in multiple key swing states that some say may have been enough to change the outcome of the election in favor of Joe Biden and the other Democrats, over 250 bills have been introduced across 43 states, aimed at making such measures as reducing voter fraud, restricting vote by mail, and requiring some form of photogenic ID in order to vote. The Brennan Center for Justice, a far-left advocacy group, has falsely claimed that such bills are attempting to suppress non-white voters. Activists at the Brennan Center and elsewhere are seeking to challenge most of these laws in court using the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the U.S. to vote on account of race or color, even though none of the proposed laws mention race in any way. The concerns over election fraud arise from the fact that supposedly nearly 67% of the voting age population cast a vote in 2020, which would by far be the highest turnout in over 100 years, but was due in large part to vote by mail being made more widely accessible due to the coronavirus pandemic. Vote by mail, which makes it much easier for people to vote who otherwise would most likely not cast a ballot, is also ripe for fraud and suppression. On Tuesday, such a case will be heard by the Supreme Court. It involves 2 election laws in the state of Arizona that requires election officials to discard ballots that have been cast in the wrong precinct, and which bans the practice of third-party groups or individuals collecting ballots, popularly known as ballot harvesting. Democrat activists have claimed, with no evidence, that these laws discriminate against Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans, while Republicans point out that the wording of the law never mentions race and maintains a neutral approach. The far-left Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the Democrats, with the Republicans appealing the case to the Supreme Court for the final decision on whether or not the state law violates the Voting Rights Act. So for our next story, we're going to go out to the state of Georgia. We're going to talk about tax cuts for Georgia. The Georgia House approved a series of legislation Wednesday that would cut hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes for Georgians. House Bill 593, dubbed the Tax Relief Act of 2021, would cut income taxes by $141 million during the first year of its full impact, state officials estimated. The House unanimously approved the bill, 171-0. Representative Shaw Blackman, a Republican from Bon Air and chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, said, quote, "The Tax Relief Act of 2021 cuts taxes on Georgians and allows them to keep more of their hard-earned money. This measure follows the tax cuts that the House passed in 2018 and 2020 in demonstrating our commitment to keeping the tax burden on Georgians as low as possible." End quote. The Tax Relief Act of 2021 raises the standard deduction on state income tax returns for a single taxpayer by $800 to $5,400 and by $1,100 to $7,100 for a married couple filing a joint return, starting in the 2022 tax year. The House also approved House Bill 586, the Georgia Economic Recovery Act of 2021, which would allow or extend sales tax exemptions for manufacturers and businesses that create jobs. It includes extensions of sales tax exemptions for regional economic development projects and is specific in manufacturing industries. It also exempts sales tax on tickets for fine art performances from nonprofits and museums. The measure cleared the House with a 164-6 vote. The House also voted 157-14 in favor of a bill aimed at attracting more businesses and the U.S. Department of Defense projects to Georgia. House Bill 587, the Georgia Economic Renewal Act of 2021, would eliminate the current job cap for states' job tax credits and add a supplemental tax credit for jobs created by medical equipment and supply manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies. The bill also extends an additional tax credit to high-impact aerospace defense projects. Representative Burt Reeves, a Republican from Marietta, said the bill could lead to extensive economic growth for the state, as the military has plans for 3 major aviation products in the next 3 years. He said, quote, "That is going to represent the next iteration of military aviation for the entire country, and Georgia has an opportunity to be the epicenter of military aviation defense with this," end quote. These 3 pieces of legislation now head to the Senate for consideration. Our next story is Who Really Imperils the Republic? FBI Director Chris Wray described the Capitol riot to Congress. He said, quote, "That attack, that siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple. And it was behavior we at the FBI view as domestic terrorism." And what had been President-elect Joe Biden's reaction at the time of the Capitol riot? Biden said, quote, "Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionist, domestic terrorists. It's that basic, it's that simple," end quote. Yet the phrase domestic terrorism conjures up events from our past far graver than a 4-hour occupation of the Capitol. Nat Turner's rebellion, John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City, to name just a few. Yet in the domestic terrorism at the Capitol, no protester set off a bomb, toppled a statue, or fired a weapon. Of the 4 who died that day, all were protesters. Was Wray's FBI alerted in advance of this impending act of domestic terrorism? Apparently it was. Writes the Washington Post, quote, "A report prepared by the FBI's Norfolk field office a day before the riot warned of specific appeals for violence, including a call for war at the Capitol. The report quoted a source urging Donald Trump's supporters to go to D.C. ready to fight. It said, quote, "Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors kicked in, and blood from their BLM and Antifa slave soldiers being spilled. Get violent, stop calling this a march or rally or a protest, go there ready for war. We get our president or we die, and nothing else will achieve this goal," end quote. What did Wray do with this hair-raising warning? Did he call the D.C. police or Speaker Nancy Pelosi to alert her to what might be coming her way? No. Wray never saw the Norfolk report. It was not passed up the chain of command to his office until after the riot. It was sent by email to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, which includes the D.C. and Capitol Police, posted on a website, and mentioned in a command center briefing in D.C. Nonchalance seemed to have been the FBI order of the day. As acting D.C. Police Chief Robert J. Conte III told Congress, quote, "I would certainly think that something as violent as an insurrection would warrant a phone call," end quote. One would think so. So explanations are needed. How can Wray call a breach of the Capitol by a Trump crowd an act of domestic terrorism when his own subordinates did not regard it as sufficiently serious enough to give him a heads up? And is it not hyperbole to use terms like domestic terrorism, armed insurrection, coup d'etat, and treason to describe protesters pushing through police lines into the Capitol to disrupt a proceeding? What's really going on here? The left will not let this go. It is exaggerating and exploiting what happened at the Capitol to paint the right as an ominous threat to American democracy and itself as the savior of the republic. It seeks to demonize the populist right, cancel its voice, expel it from the public square, and redefine it as a conspiracy against America, calling forth new government authority and power to monitor, expose, and destroy it. If assaulting cops and besieging public buildings amounts to domestic terrorism, the rioting, looting, arson, and assaults on cops we saw all last summer in Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, Kenosha, and Louisville from Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters would more than qualify. Today, Capitol Hill is encircled with high fencing topped by razor wire and patrolled by National Guard troops. It looks like the Green Zone in Baghdad. Apparently, the physical barriers and troops are there to protect against attacks by QAnon and white supremacists. But with Minneapolis preparing for the trial of Derek Chauvin for the second-degree murder in the death of George Floyd, and maybe Minneapolis, not Capitol Hill, where the action will be this spring. And that's the report. And that's this week's Heartland View. As always, if you'd like to see the full details on these stories as well as many others, there's a lot of public policy things happening. You might want to check out our website, heartlanddailynews.com. And if you'd like to support an organization that's trying to provide information and analysis to you on public policy events, please consider donating to the Heartland Institute. You can do so on our website, heartland.org. Thank you for your time. Have a great week.